stations again. Looking for a familiar song or a friendly voice, only to find yourself here. You're listening to Black Hole Radio. The Hauling. We live on a placid island of ignorance, in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. H.P. Lovecraft. I am a geophysicist by profession, and it was in the ordinary course of my measurements that I first observed the deviation. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a slight, though deeply peculiar inconsistency in readings, minuscule, nearly dismissible, the sort of discrepancy ordinarily attributed to instrument drift or possible thermal interference. No single station reported anything severe enough to justify alarm, which in retrospect is precisely why the phenomenon began unnoticed. What troubled me most, in those first days at least, was not the magnitude of the event, but its distribution, its uniformity. Stations at higher latitudes, northern Canada, Scandinavia, coastal Alaska, and others reported lesser anomalies, while those nearer the equator recorded progressively greater deviations. Soon, the pattern emerged with an unpleasant clarity, a gradient. It was during this period that the first biological anomalies were reported. First were the birds. There were no mass die-offs, but something more subtle. Species ordinarily known for long-distance flight began to cluster inexplicably around terrain, exhibiting an unusual hesitation before takeoff. They would launch and for a time glide as expected, but failed to maintain altitude. They simply ceased to be supported by the medium they had always relied upon. At the time, I did not associate this with the gravitational deviations I'd observed, which were then still very slight. The association only came later, when the tide stopped. Harbors held their water in unnatural stillness. Shorelines fell into putrid stagnation. Vessels, stranded offshore, reported no wave activity, no currents at all. It was as though the ocean itself, in all of its magnitude, had been placed under conceptual arrest. It lay, placid and darkened, a single vast plain of glass. Reports of inexplicable sinkings began soon thereafter. Steadily, the anomaly intensified, and not a soul on Earth could deny that something vast and without explanation was underway. Then came the fatigue. It did not present as disease, there was no pathogen or known toxin, yet the effect was plainly evident and global. People nearest the equator became unable to sustain ordinary physical or cognitive effort. Standing required focused attention. Conversation required exertion. Even internal thought itself seemed to move slowly and heavily through some thickened medium. Sleep did not restore, it deepened the condition. It was at this stage that I formalized what I had been avoiding. The deviation was latitudinal. The closer one moved to the equator, the more pronounced the anomalies became. I then made the decision that would define the remainder of my life's work. If there remained anywhere on Earth unaffected, it would be about the poles. I left 2 days later, believing I was traveling toward stability. The journey confirmed my earlier equations, and as I traveled northward, the effect of the phenomenon grew less pronounced, though still apparently present. Aircraft no longer climbed with their former ease, not due to turbulence, but a subtle degradation of lift. Passengers spoke little, conserving thought in a strange economy of effort. As I crossed into higher latitudes, I allowed myself a brief, cautious relief. The instrument stabilized. Gravitational variance readings, though still incorrect, were less extreme. This was consistent with my hypothesis of a field effect diminishing toward the poles. I noted it in my field log with professional satisfaction. A solution, or at the very minimum an explanation, seemed within reach. That illusion did not last. I arrived at the Polar Research Station to find that nominal had become the most frequent word in the technical logs, a linguistic attempt to preserve equilibrium. But nothing felt nominal. The effort required to remain upright had decreased only in comparison to the latitudes I had left behind. It was not that gravitation had normalized, it was that the deviation had not yet fully arrived here. I stood now as far as was possible to be from whatever drain was sucking and dragging the world downward and inward, yet still caught, helpless within its current. Communication from lower latitudes ceased in any recognizable form shortly after my arrival, though fragments continued to arrive through degraded relay channels for several days. They were no longer reports in any meaningful sense, degrading to only brief and partial bursts, sensor alarms, and garbled audio segments stripped of context. According to the final coherent transmission, terrain at equatorial stations had ceased to exhibit stratification. Soil, stone, and infrastructure alike were, apparently, though I could not imagine how, no longer differentiated at all, but a single compacted, flattened mass. The very end of that last transmission, distorted and broken, clearly contained the phrase, "No space remaining between objects." After that, even fragmentary reporting ceased. The final confirmation came from a composite analysis. The data, what little of it I had received and been able to make any sense of, resolved into an increasingly directional geometry, a global vector field. Everything was being drawn into a single malevolent alignment along a singularly insane axis. The equator had already fully transitioned, and, positioned as near the pole as I could achieve, I realized in horror that I had mistaken delay for exemption. Several hours ago, the instruments began to alter their behavior in the most unsettling way. They became consistent, not correct, but perfectly and intolerably steady. In the far southward distance, where up until recently there stood massive and jagged mountains, this morning I saw only a flat metallic plane without color or motion. The planet has become like a massive and featureless steel bearing. The sky an eternally yawning black maw. Even by daylight, the sun and stars now share that cosmic field above. I closed the blinds and will not look out again. Every breath drawn now is a great labor. Increasingly, I suspect there is little time left, if any at all. Worse, given the circumstances, I believe this writing may be utterly purposeless, as none will remain to read it. For all of my calculations and measurements, for all of my suppositions and ultimately my desperate expedition northward, I have learned nothing of the cause of this phenomenon. I seem to have only delayed, briefly, my own inevitable end. I am sorry, to whom and what for I do not know, but I am. I cannot fathom what has happened to the world, but I feel it happening in my bones now too. I can hear the moaning of the structures inside and out, the downwardness, the hauling, even through the ringing in my ears that started just this past moment. I've just heard something else outside, a kind of crunching, a sickening electrical crackle. A grotesque and inescapable collapse is fast approaching, utter and absolute. Magnets eating everything, buzzing and grinding. There was something else. Everything drawn, dragged, hauled in a kind of silent violence into a singular and impossibly dense condition. I am so afraid. I don't understand. I didn't have time. As I write these helpless words even, the very pen in my hand grows too heavy to bear. I cannot.